People seem to think that we're all labourers, we only dig roads and we only fight outside pubs on Saturday nights. That is an image that the Irish came over to the docks originally, the image they portrayed, and now that is the image which we're saddled with today. Now when you look at particularly nurses, school teachers, clergymen, doctors, you find Irish people in all sorts of positions, so high and low and all sorts. So it's just nearly time we lost this image of just being drinking, single men spending our time drinking.
The Irish should be the most compatible of immigrants. They're white, Christian, and speak the same language. There have been Irish people in England for many centuries, and the census of 1871 recorded over 1 million resident here. Despite all this, the Irish in Britain have often stayed slightly apart from society, and prejudice against them has always run deep.
The street alongside Harrods has been sealed off and closely guarded all day, while every inch of the...
To most English people, and many Irish men and women, this is mindless violence. But the Irish also understand the reasons, though not the justifications, for such atrocities. Reasons based on the long and tortured relationship between the English and the Irish. A history that the English often choose to ignore, as Dr. Anthony Clare and his wife Jane see it.
We, as Irish people, find it impossible for anyone to understand it unless they have a historical dimension. And the Englishman says, you Irish, you're preoccupied with a historical dimension. You'll never forget anything. And we say, but the reason you don't understand Northern Ireland, and indeed us, is that you constantly forget everything.
We were brought up with a very clear view of history, that, you know, England did Ireland wrong, and it has to be said that we carry this, in a sense, with us. I think a lot of Irish people do.
The Normans conquered Ireland in 1167. Since then, the Irish and the English have played out the roles of conquerors and conquered. These two different perspectives often make for different views of history. Oliver Cromwell believed he went to Ireland to carry out the great work against the barbarous and bloodthirsty Irish after the revolt of Ulster. But to the Irish, battles like Drogheda were just merciless slaughter. William III conceded freedom of religion to his Catholic subjects, but the gesture was hollow, as they couldn't hold government office or own much land. Some English writers, like Samuel Johnson, bemoaned the distresses and miseries of the Irish nation, but it was left to the Irish writer Jonathan Swift to mock English prejudices with his ironic, modest proposal to cure Irish poverty. The peasants should boil and eat their babies. In 1798, Catholics rebelled against their landlords. What was an outcry against oppression for the Irish was wicked insubordination to the English. 3 years later, the Act of Union brought Ireland into the United Kingdom. 105 Irish MPs went to Westminster, but till 1829 they were all Protestants, and Irish peasants remained exploited. In 1846, a Privy Councillor even held them responsible for the potato blight and famine, as they were obstinate and indolent, reckless and savage, intent on doing as little and getting as much as they can. If the famine reinforced some British stereotypes of the Irish, it also reinforced some Irish myths. Far from being indifferent, the British government organised its first large-scale famine relief. Nevertheless, many died, and 1,200,000 Irish men and women had emigrated to America and England by 1860. Those Irish who came to Britain met prejudice, but did find work. In the 1830s, a government report had blamed the poverty of the Irish on their temperament, and most of them believed the British view that the best they could hope for was manual work. Historian Colin Holmes.
The Irish are very important in laying the basic infrastructure of British society. They're absolutely crucial, for example, in laying the railways. They're important, in fact, in labouring activity generally. They are the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, play a very important role within the British economy in the course of the 19th century.
Gladstone had enough sympathy for the Irish to pass laws giving Irish tenants more rights in 1882 and got Parliament to vote £2 million to pay off their rent arrears. But the English never managed to concede what would eventually seem a modest demand, home rule. Still, the navvies kept on coming. One of their monuments is the ornamental lake at Hever Castle.
In 1871, the Irish are the largest group that we have in this country, and they're coming in basically because of the problems of scraping together a living in Ireland, but also because of the attraction of job opportunities in Britain.
Originally, there had been both Protestants and Catholics who had demanded home rule. But by 1910, that had become very much a Catholic cause. On Easter Day, 1916, Republican rebels took over the post office in Dublin. The British executed the leaders and roused Republican feelings. 5 years later, the Irish Free State came into being. Despite the violence and the rhetoric, the Free State retained strong links with Britain. Common citizenship was held to exist, so that Irish citizens were not subject to any immigration controls and could vote in Britain. In cities like Liverpool and London, the Irish population grew steadily, though in the 30s, immigration tailed off with high unemployment. When war broke out, Éire declared itself neutral, which the British resented, but some 50,000 Irish citizens volunteered to fight or work for the Allied cause.
The Southern Irish were neutral in that war, and this raised an important problem. Britain is short of labour. Can it utilise the reserve army that exists in Ireland, or is this too dangerous because these people are neutral? In effect, the British government decides, yes, we will import Irish labour in the war because we need them, but we import them under quite strict controls.
Tony Murphy worked at Ford's factory in Cork.
I was working there as a storekeeper, and eventually it was a case of running out of jobs. And then I had the offer of coming to Dagenham. And at that time it meant it wasn't just get on the boat and head for Dagenham. You'd apply for a passport and a visa, which took a considerable time, because so many were leaving Ireland that time, and as I said, the British Embassy in Dublin was snowed under with passport applications.
The motives of the Irish were often considered suspect.
About 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, the siren went to Ford's and Dagenham, and we saw a plane going up as if it was on fire. It travelled up, flame was shooting out of its tail, and eventually we heard the bang. When I came home from work in the morning, I found a plane had crashed not far from where I was living in Diggs in Bow. It actually had dropped in Antill Road in Bow, not far from where I was. Immediately the rumour went that a German plane had crashed and the pilot had bailed out over Dagenham and the Irish were hiding him. Then...
Don't you think that's actually fairly symptomatic of...
That would size up the facts of the outlook on the Irish at those times. That's how they felt the Irish were kind of anti-British, anti-war.
After the war, an estimated 500,000 Irishmen came to Britain, mainly through Liverpool. Historian Colin Holmes.
It isn't really until the 1950s that Irish labour comes in very large numbers, say in the levels that it reached in the 19th century. And this is at a time of labour shortage in British society. The Irish come in, for example, to work on the Festival of Britain side and to build the motorways.
They came off the ferry and went on the road, proud of their strength. They didn't mind being on the lump, since that meant not paying taxes. But like many immigrants before and since, this stopped them joining unions, forced them to put up with appalling working conditions, and exposed them to exploitation. There'd been unions in the construction industry since the 1850s, and when Jack Henry came to Britain in the 1950s, he was soon to see why they were needed.
I left as a result of mass unemployment, bad social conditions. Those that were employed were working extremely long hours under very difficult conditions. And so, like many, many other Irishmen before, I simply thought, well, there's not much you can do here, move on.
This is the gospel of the Lord.
Not all Irishmen relied on their muscles, though. Father Claude Malone first came to London in the 1950s as a young priest. He knew the Irish community needed spiritual attention, for they were, after all, in an almost heathen land.
There is a tradition in Ireland of emigrating. When I finished school at the age of 18, I went on to college and I began to study for the priesthood. But the alternative was, and it was quite clear in my mind, that with one or two of my colleagues at school, I would have come to London. We would have found work. That's what they did. There were, I think, in the town I came from, 14 or 15 of us who finished school at leaving certificate level that year. And half of those, at least, just came to England.
There was, in those days, a certain amount of unemployment in Manchester. And it snowed. I never forget the first winter. It snowed badly in those years. That particular year that a number of us were unemployed. And the most horrifying thought was tramping the streets of this new city that I thought was paved with gold, and finding to my alarm that it wasn't. And in fact, unemployment was pretty severe there. And the absolute isolation then, you couldn't go back. You hadn't enough to go from there to anywhere else.
And now we're on the road again with the bugle pipes, fusiliers. I've stripped to the skin with the darky fin way down upon the island.
You began to learn about the construction industry. You began to learn that you could be sacked at a moment's notice. You began to form relationships with the people within those construction projects. So that became, not so much, in my opinion, a job. It became a way of life.
And woe to he who went to look for tea with bugle pipes, fusiliers.
In those days, they had to do it for 10 and 12 hours a day. There was no time and a half, and there was no washing facilities. And if you asked for a cup of tea, they thought you were stone mad. For example, if you moved into Basingstoke with a big building project, McAlpine might be doing the job and he would need 500 or 600 men. And this peaceful little town would all of a sudden be confronted by a horde of men, rough diamonds from the construction industry, almost like the Klondike in a way. And the natives would become alarmed by these because of their drinking habits. And I think discrimination would then begin to filter through. So they would find themselves not getting digs. And often you've seen them sleeping in the big pipes. Some would sleep in ditches, some would sleep in caravans or wherever.
We find that they had special groups of people who used to come up every Tuesday and Thursday night to write letters, because quite a lot of them were illiterate, to write letters to their mothers, to read letters that they had received from home. And when they were sending this money back home, they wanted to just earn as much as they can.
So I've had the unfortunate experience of seeing a couple of people actually killed and watch them die lying on the floors of building sites. The two in particular that were pretty terrifying to look at was one, I was standing right beside him when he hit the floor, and the other one I watched from about 30 yards come all the way from around about 11 stories, right onto the ground. And you just watched them. One of them bled to death, and the other one was pretty badly broke up. And you begin to wonder why. And if you said to the employers that conditions of safety are intolerable, something should be done about, they'd almost imply in return in those days, well, they shouldn't really have been working there.
I feel that the Irish community of today, who, if you like, who have lived in a bit of the glory of what these men created, and who've gotten on all right because of the hard times that they had. And let us remember, we talk about discrimination today and ethnic minorities. They were very much discriminated against in the early days. The Irish were. No Irish need apply. Many of the people around here will tell you to remember well the days of those notices.
The construction industry has changed over the years, and many of the unskilled jobs are now done by West Indians. From Victorian times on, Irish immigrants have changed London, building new churches in the East End and making Kentish Town not very Kentish. Tony Murphy remembers a moment in the 1950s when he realised just how many Irishmen had come to North London.
When I came into this area first, I went to a church at Tollington Park, and it was not much bigger than this room we're sitting in. And gradually, as the concrete, which was adequate at the time, but as immigration started really to flow in the 60s, late 50s, we had an occasion one night where we had a missioner and packed all the ships where a preacher would come along and preach a particular sermon. And they packed the church one night, which was actually standing room only. Had to take the benches out and pack in several hundred people, with people milling outside. But the service was ready to start, but there was only one snag. We couldn't get the priest in, and had to rig up a ladder and get him in through the windows. Was the only means of getting into the building without sharing it.
One of the advantages of a bigger society, not just Britain, would be that people can find themselves a bit more. One of the disadvantages is that people can get lost. And the Catholic Church's concern in Ireland in the 50s as to concerning the fate of emigrants to Britain was partly bounded on a truth, which was that people brought up in a very secure, safe, and relatively unchanging society, suddenly finding themselves in a very open, secular, and flexible society, can go to the wall.
Irish writers like James Joyce have often ridiculed the Catholic Church for its narrowness. In the 1960s, for many Irish young people, London was a tempting pit of iniquity. To the horror of the church, they came to have a good time, and some girls came to get abortions that are even today illegal in Ireland. Father Claude Malone remembers shipping many distraught youngsters back to rural Ireland where the church felt they belonged. For Malone, this was a mission.
In the end of the 60s, yes, it was quite a common problem, because we had a lot of very young people, maybe 16-year-olds, who would get it into their heads, take Figari, as we say, and take off and just get on the boat. The fare wasn't all that much. And they would arrive here, and God knows their parents demented looking for them.
There have always been plenty of Irishmen who didn't fit the thick Mick stereotype. While music hall audiences guffawed at the drunken Paddy, the West End was amused by Sheridan, dazzled by Wilde, provoked by Shaw, and entranced by Ninette de Valois, all Irish artists whom the British now claim as their own. The fear of being taken over lock, stock, and shamrock is well understood by psychiatrist Dr. Clare and his wife Jane.
We were quite used from the time that we went to university to the idea that we would probably have to leave after we qualified to either further our education or get employment. And it was something that actually I looked forward to. I anticipated that I'd probably live abroad at some point. And I didn't make a lot of friends. I don't think one does. I mean, I think that's the major difference between the Irish and the English, is stereotyped as it may be, the fact that the Irish are easy to get on with, easy to chat to. Here, it takes ages to make friends.
It was months before I realized that the fact that people passed you without ever acknowledging you, or with a blink of the eyes, wasn't rudeness, wasn't some kind of superior English attitude to foreigners. It was just the way people behaved. And that actually gradually, when you got to know my colleagues, I realized they're very warm and friendly, brought a heightened sense of privacy. But you can get through that. But it does take time. And if you're in any way paranoid or sensitive, then the relative detachment of the Englishman might be seen, erroneously often, as indifference.
In 1982, Islington Council banned Irish jokes. The rationale was that the Irish had been so damaged by being the butt of English jokes that it had to stop.
Up to a point, I have always felt I could take an Irish joke, and I could tell probably better Irish jokes than what I normally had. But the jokes we had were not Irish jokes. They were malicious jokes against the Irish, which is a different thing altogether.
The Irish have nothing to fear from anti-Irish jokes. They reveal more about the person who tells them than the people they're told about. At the present time, there's a vogue for a certain kind of anti-Irish joke. My children tell me the latest, and I'm glad to say they don't seem in the slightest bit offended by the implications of some of them. I don't like them particularly. I think it reveals an unfortunate side of the English character. But I understand why they occur. But the central point is I think that they reveal an insecurity which I don't think the Irish in Britain have any reason to feel.
When the column came first, in a friend of mine, the jokes were going off the Irish a bit, going on from the colours, a friend of mine said to me, well, thank God for the arrival of the blacks. Now they'll take the pressure off the paddies.
Like other immigrant groups, the Irish worry about losing their identity if they assimilate too much.
I always will feel that I'm an Irish person. My Irish passport is very important to me. I wouldn't switch that for anything. Someday, perhaps, when I retire, I'll go back. I don't think that my children will live there, and that's something that you have to come to terms with, I think, as an emigre parent, that your children are not going to be Irish in the way that you were. They will have some good feelings about it because family, grandparents are still there. But I think my children who have grown up here now regard England and specifically London as home.
And the Irish Centre runs classes where children can learn their own music and culture.
It's particularly important when they're living away from home to be proud of their heritage, especially when the media spends a lot of time telling jokes and generally making them feel bad about themselves. It's important that we tell them to be very proud of their heritage and background. It's a nice way to bring out the Irishness in them in music and dance. There couldn't be any nicer way.
A majority of the English suspect that many Irish people secretly condone the IRA. But some of the Irish people living in England, like Tony Murphy, believe IRA activities actually threaten the position of the Irish here.
We felt terribly embarrassed by the different tragedies that happened in this country. We were probably more outraged than the English people, because if any backlash was to come, we were going to get the backlash. I wouldn't have blamed anybody, knowing me, and I'm fairly well known in this area because I was a borough councillor for 7 years or so. And people know that I was in the Labour Party and as such. And I was many, many times waiting for a firebomb to come through my window. And to be quite honest with you, at some of the times I wouldn't really been surprised if I had got it.
For instance, if there's a bomb scare, if there's an atrocity, because we're the Irish Centre, you look in the book and you look up Irish, Irish, Irish. First thing you see is Irish Centre. We get the abusive calls hour after hour after hour after these. And we have to take them, and we get the threats. But I always believe and maintain that the people who phone us up and threaten us and are the cause of us having to evacuate our building and call in the bomb squad to search it are no better than the people who commit these atrocities in the beginning.
This kind of thing going on in Northern Ireland is complete embarrassment to us because it's bringing out animosity towards us. I have never had the animosity shown to me because I make a point of when people are discussing the Northern Ireland situation, I will not take part in it, even with Irish people.
Obviously, the great national events of recent years here, the Queen's Jubilee and the wedding of Charles and Diana, these were very British events, which, for me, I couldn't quite understand the depth of feeling and emotion that people were experiencing, the things that they were prepared to do, to be present at the wedding or attend the functions and so on. And these sort of occasions make me very aware of my Irishness.
And those are the moments where if you're part of the society, you recognize it. And if you're not, you recognize that too. And at the moment of the Jubilee or the wedding, one sensed that this was something for this society. This was its moment of expressing its identity and its unity. And in that sense, that's Irish.
Given the problems of the British in Ireland, one might have expected the Irish in Britain to be less successful than they have been. There are many Murphys and O'Carrolls who remember their Irish roots, but see themselves as perfectly British. Individuals who wanted to assimilate may have found it easier being Christian and white, but as a group, the Irish have still had much in common with more foreign immigrants.